Hey everyone, this right here is my lesson plan on waiting to inhale. I will be posting this as a PDF so you guys can give it a further look, but I just wanted to talk about some of it to begin with. I'm going to scroll right down. I know there's a whole bunch of stuff at the beginning, but I want to first talk about how the actual class period would go. So right here, we talk about the previous lesson. And in the previous lesson, we're going to be talking about the idea of slope-intercept form, which is an equation that says y equals mx plus b. So we want to talk about what those letters are. So we will have done that in the previous class. And because of the fact that that's our baseline of where we're starting, whoops, I scrolled down just a little too far. So here, right here is our hook, talking about how we're going to go ahead and just try to initiate a discussion with students about, oh, what do they think the average cost of smoking might be per year? Talking about, oh, well, yes, there's a dollar amount for a carton, but then there's also money for matches and for breath fresheners or hospital visits, things like that. So there's a lot of both explicit and implicit or prices for smoking that we can deal with. Then what I would do is I would go ahead and link from that to talking about how what we learned in the previous class about slope-intercept form and about a linear model right here, how we can go ahead and use that to model a real-world situation with money. Now, just in case students are struggling with that idea, or perhaps have kind of had not been able to remember too much of what they did the day before, I'm going to provide a handout that just kind of serves as a refresher. Talks about slope-intercept form. Slope is rise over run right here, and then explains what that means in terms of this lesson. It's going to be made for the EL learners, but I'm not about to say that in class. I will say, hey, this is a handout available for anybody that needs a little refresher. So once we kind of get that started, we're going to create an XY plot on the board. We'll leave the x-axis in years and the y-axis in dollars. That way, I'm modeling for the students, how I want them to label things and what the context is. Then what students are going to go ahead and have to tell me what the x-intercept and the y-intercept mean. That's where the line crosses the x-axis and the y-axis, so that way they understand. Oh, I've got a starting point for years and I've got a starting point for dollars. Um, there's going to be room for input because I do kind of want to go ahead and allow for a little bit of conversation, but at the same time I don't want it to be used as an opportunity to shame students if they're not a little unsure what's going on. Then we're going to go ahead and talk about, okay, well, yes, in the hook we went ahead and said, oh, there's many costs for smoking, but to make the math a little bit more explicit, we're going to go ahead and say that the pack costs $5 each pack. And so then we're going to go ahead and have the students get into groups, and they need to calculate how much it would cost, to purchase, to smoke a pack a week, then a month, and then a year. And then, if they're not certain as to, oh, how does that work mathematically, I will go ahead and put on the board, okay, this is how many days are in a week, this is how many days are in a month, and this is how many days are in a year, to hopefully get them connected to the idea that, oh, they can just go ahead and multiply that by $5, to kind of get an idea of what the slope would be and what that line would mean. Right here, EL students would be able to listen to the lecture and just take notes. I would love to get them involved in the conversation, but I'm going to try to make the conversation as open as possible. As I stated earlier, I'm going to make the labels explicit on the board because I want students to be able to know, one, that's what I want from them, and two, that's what gives the context to the y equals mx plus b. Otherwise, it's just another equation that they're doing and it has zero context. So once this whole class has kind of a model equation, they've been able to kind of graph, on their, their finding of, various things like that. And then after that, I'm going to go ahead and kind of, I'll have a worksheet for them. They'll be talking about the slopes of, parallel lines and kind of, figuring out, how to work with inflation and possibly, if they're a little stuck on that, because I'll use that kind of as like an extra level, just in case there's students who, oh, I already understand this idea, but I'm not going to make that a mandatory part of the lesson, so that students who don't fully understand that idea still feel like they can complete the lesson and still feel confident in their mathematical skills and abilities. Right here, I'm going to offer an informal assessment. I will walk around and monitor student work. I'm going to provide help as the students need it, and I'm going to encourage students to work both, with their classmates. And depending on who the student is, I may go ahead and just immediately answer their question, or I may challenge them by asking a student that's nearby them. Again, I want students to develop their own independence, but if they don't have that yet, I do not wish to shame them at all. At the very end of the class, we'll kind of go ahead and talk about, oh, well, what are things that somebody else would be able to purchase with that money that they would spend on smoking, and try to get the students to realize, hey, there's a cost and a benefit to this thing, and as they realize, oh, they're spending more money on smoking, they could be saving that money and spending something else. So my hope is that the lesson would both begin and end with not talking simply about the y equals mx plus b part of the graph, but talk about actually how that represents money being spent in a real world context. Okay, so that's kind of how the lesson would go. Now I want to go back up and talk about, kind of my methodology for talking about everything. Right here, you see the essential literacy strategy focus. We want to see how linear functions can be used to solve problems modeled, in real world. Students so often ask, hey, when am I going to use such and such idea in the real world? We want to try to be answering that question for them and almost kind of anticipating that question, so we're answering it before it's even asked. So some of the related skills that they are going to be utilizing, and I'm going to make sure that they have, interpreting the equation, is defining a linear function whose graph is a straight line. They should see that once they start graphing their points. Graphing ordered pairs, that would be putting the year amount with the dollar amount, changing linear equations into slope-intercept form, and understanding what a rate of change is, which is another word for slope. So the daily focus will be analyzing and solving that specific linear equation, graphing it, and understanding how that models the real-world situation. Right here are some of the math contents. As you can see, this focuses on a grade 8 math level, talking about functions and how they relate to linear relationships. Here in the instructions, I want the students to be able to describe the slope characteristics of parallel lines. That means they need to understand, that right here, informally, that I'm going to try to get them to all communicate that slopes of parallel lines should be the same. And here, they should be able to use linear relationships to predict, the financial cost of smoking. So even if they haven't, looked at, 8-10 years down the line, if they've looked at 2-3 years, they should be able to predict how it will go further. This is where, the independent practice part will come, where I'll be monitoring the room during their understanding. And here, at the very end, we want students to be able to give contextual meaning to x and y intercepts. Otherwise, how do they fully understand the real world model? Some of the vocabulary that they need, I've kind of been using this. Slope, y-intercept, x-intercept. Coordinate plane is something that I would like them to know, but if they still are referring to an xy plane, I will accept that. I want them to more understand what that means rather than what the word is. So I would be willing to let that slide. However, with the x-axis and the y-axis, if students are having trouble with that, that's going to provide a very big problem as they're working. Here, the language function, students are going to reason and analyze, and right there, that reinforces the Common Core standards that I referenced earlier. Here, they're going to go ahead and see how, using linear relationships, just like we talked about earlier in the focus for the day, to be able to predict the financial cost of smoking. Students will need rulers. They'll need an informational packet on smoking, a whiteboard, and a handout on slope-intercept form. One of the things that I've realized in talking with my methods teacher is that as I make the lesson plan, it's important to include those handouts. I did not for this, and so that's an area where I need to grow a little bit, and I realize that, but I did not wish to include them now to falsely seem like I have perfected that skill. Right here, we're talking about the prior knowledge. I related that in when I talked initially about what had happened in the previous class, previous activity. Students should already be familiar with graphing linear equations and calculating exponents. The exponents part is not what am going to stress in the lesson, but it is something that I would like students to be able to do, and so I will offer that as kind of a extension if students are finding the original lesson a little too easy. So that is a way that I will scaffold beyond the initial focus of the lesson, if that's necessary. However, students should definitely be familiar with the coordinate plane, plotting points on the coordinate plane, and understanding, y equals mx plus b. So in the lesson that I will be constructing, I'm going to go ahead and show how y equals mx plus b can be more than just a formula where students are plugging in numbers and doing straight math. That is abstract, but they are connecting it to a real world idea, the financial impact of smoking. And so that is the whole reason why I'm tying this in with the lesson that I'm doing. All right? Thanks, guys.